Dear audience, welcome to the show POWERchat. In today's episode, we'll be discussing on United Nations Development Support in Nepal. Joining us today is Ms. Valerie Julliand, Resident Coordinator of the United Nations in Nepal. Please allow me to welcome her. Welcome to the show, Ms. Julliand.
Thank you very much for having me.
How have you been?
Very fine, thank you so much.
Well, it's already more than a year that you
is.
joined Nepal as the Resident Coordinator of United Nations.
Yes.
What is your initial impressions over Nepal's development process?
You know, it's interesting because when I arrived in Nepal, I didn't know really what to expect because I had never worked in Asia. I was coming from Latin America, from Africa, from Eastern Europe. And when I started to get acquainted with the history of Nepal and see what it was, I would say for me the element that really strikes me is how fast Nepal has changed and developed. Really, because if you consider that Nepal started to open to the world in 1950. In these 70 years, Nepal has been able to go through so many changes, so many revolutions, having a war, changing from monarchy to democracy, and now to a federal system. If I consider even other places in the world, if I compare Nepal with, for instance, Europe, you have achieved in 70 years what took us several centuries in Europe to do. So I would say that for me is a very striking element, is the speed at which the country is changing and evolving.
How do you observe the diversity of Nepal?
Well, first of all, I think it's one of the richness of Nepal. That's really the wealth of Nepal, that diversity in people. And that's so visible, even I would say in the appearance of people. You can't say a Nepali looks like this. You know, there is not a single definition of what a Nepali looks like because of this diversity in ethnic group. And also, I think it's really the most interesting element of Nepal, and this is really on what Nepal should capitalize to develop further.
Well, how do you observe the significance of United Nations in Nepal?
You know, but first of all, it's difficult maybe to have a proper evaluation of oneself. But what I would say, to evaluate what a United Nations does in any country, it's not an easy task, simply because our work is first and foremost a work of support. We support the government in all its endeavors. So when something is achieved, it would be a bit, I would say, of bad taste, I would say, to say that it's only thanks to us that this is happening. But I can say what the UN have contributed to. I think, first of all, there is the peace process. The UN was present and was heavily involved in the peace process. These are the two parties to the conflict that signed peace, but the UN was there. And I think that the contribution of the UN has been a very positive one. But I also see the contribution of the UN in support of the efforts of the government, for instance, to achieve the MDGs, to reduce poverty, to reduce child mortality or maternal mortality, to reduce hunger. So all these are contribution of the UN. We also have a lot of work that we do, which sometimes is actually criticized. But it's an important work, and it's a work we do all over the world. It's a work in support to policies. Because as UN, we always bring a wealth of knowledge from other countries. Like, for instance, when we help a given government, to elaborate policies, social policies, for instance, we will always bring together with our support the experiences from other countries that will enrich the reflection for the given country we are assisting. And this is also a lot of support that the UN has given for the elaboration of a number of policies. As you know, the United Nations, they are, let's say, the guardian of all the international conventions. Nepal is signatory to a number of international conventions on human rights, on the right of children, on environment, and so on and so forth. So that's why the work of policies is important and misunderstood very often by some observers, because they see that as a way to influence. No, the work of policy is to make sure that all the commitment that the country has taken, like Nepal signing a number of conventions, that these are translated into appropriate policies where the country can fulfill its commitment and adopt the policies that will help its development. So this is also one of the contributions of the UN. And there is also a work that we do directly with the people, with the populations themselves. This is less. This is a minor activity that we have, because mostly the work of the UN is in support to the government, but we also work directly in support to the population. So all in all, as I say, it's difficult to say this is thanks to the UN, but we contributed. And I would say this is what we want to do, to contribute.
Well, Ms. Julliand, you highlighted on the United Nations work here in Nepal, also explained about Nepal's commitment to international community on several international treaties of the human rights. How do you see the implementation status of human rights laws or treaties?
Sure. First of all, Nepal is a very active member of the United Nations. They really, as a country, they really want to be part of the organization, and therefore they do participate in many aspects. And they take very seriously, as a country, some of its commitment. For instance, I mentioned earlier on the fact that Nepal managed to achieve excellent results on the Millennium Development Goals for the period 2000 to 2015. And Nepal is therefore equally committed to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals for this next period of 2015-2030. So I would say on some aspect, Nepal is very proactive and is doing a lot of efforts. Now, when it comes to the human rights conventions, and I would say Nepal is still struggling with some aspects of it. Like, for instance, right now, 10 years after having signed the peace agreement, the transitional justice process is not moving as it should. Actually, one has to recognize that the country has decided to have the proper institution to deal with that, with the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as well as the Commission on Enforced Disappearance. However, the act that gave birth to these two conventions actually has some elements that are in contradiction with international human rights law. And the Supreme Court of Nepal noted that and gave a judgment asking the act to be amended. So right now, Nepal is in the process of amending the act, because right now this act is in contradiction with the international human rights.
Well, I will come back to you on the transitional justice process of Nepal. Sure. Could you tell us in a nutshell the most outstanding progresses that have taken place in Nepal due to the presence of United Nations here?
As I said again, I would not, because otherwise I will have a lot of people phoning me now and saying, Valerie, you exaggerate. I will never say that what has been achieved in Nepal is only thanks to the United Nations. But the United Nations contributed, and I dare say that the United Nations contributed to the efforts of Nepal in reducing poverty, in reducing, as I said, child mortality and infant mortality, in addressing some of the critical health issues, as well as education. These are the striking changes. As well, Nepal has made some progress on the issue of climate change, environment, and this as well, United Nations was working side by side with Nepal. So I would say these are big changes. When it comes to human rights, I would believe as well that, thanks to the support of the United Nations and the commitment of the country, some progress has been made. And I would say, for instance, when the country adopted the constitution in 2015, that constitution, the actual one, is actually very progressive, because it recognizes the fact that there is a need for more inclusion. It recognizes that there are such a diversity that was not equally represented in the country, that didn't have equal access to opportunities. So the constitution in itself is recognizing that. And that, I would also consider that the UN has contributed to that. I would not want to take away the merit of the people who did the constitution as such, but as I say, we have been a long-standing partner of Nepal. The United Nations are in Nepal, are on the side of Nepal for more than 50 years. For the last 50 years, we have been present at the side of the different governments of Nepal. So equally, our imprint on the development, is there. But we are one actor among many actors. But our role is very often, that cartoon of Pinocchio, that story of Pinocchio, that character who has his nose that grows when he lies. He also has, Pinocchio, a little insect on his shoulder, Jiminy Cricket, that is a bit like his conscience, sometimes, reminding him, not Pinocchio, you should not do this and that. I often say that we, United Nations, we are a little bit the Jiminy Cricket of governments, in the sense that we are there to remind them when things are not good. So that's why sometimes, it's not always pleasant to have somebody tell you, maybe you don't do good on that. But at the same time, we do it because we really believe that in Nepal, and we want Nepal to develop well.
Well, you said that Nepal's transitional justice process, somehow the instruments formed here, including that of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on the Disappeared People, are not really working in line with the international mandate. What needs to be improved? What needs to be done so that transitional justice instruments work properly?
The main contention that the Supreme Court highlighted in its resolution, with which we are in agreement because it's actually coherent with international law, is that in the current act, it is said that the Commission, the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, has in its prerogative to decide whether a crime can be amnestied without any other specification. And that in itself is in contravention with international law. Because in international human rights law and in the Human Rights Convention that Nepal has signed and ratified, it is clearly said that no matter the context, the reasons or else, there are certain crimes that cannot ever be amnestied. And therefore, in the act that needs to be amended, it has to be said very clearly that while the Commission retains the prerogative to amnesty certain crimes, it cannot, under any circumstances, amnesty the 4 major crimes that are the killings. You cannot amnesty killing. It has to be prosecuted. After that, the justice goes its way and decide what should be the sentence for a given crime. But a crime can never be amnestied. Rape, sexual violence, torture, and disappearance. These are the 4 types of crimes that cannot be amnestied by anybody under any circumstances. So that is the main point that makes that today the Commission, for instance, we cannot and we will not, as United Nations, support the Truth and Reconciliation Commission or the Commission on Disappearance, because if we were supporting them under the current act, it would be tantamount to condoning and to accepting that a commission can amnesty these crimes. But from the moment the act is amended, we as United Nations will stand full-fledged behind the commissions to help them. And there are such an amount of help that they need and they want, and they have asked us as well. They need to be supported with expertise. They need to be supported with, for instance, drafting and elaborating a number of procedures. They need to be supported with resources, with investigation. So all this we could bring. So for as long as the Commission has the prerogative to amnesty, it means that this Commission is in contravention. So that's the main flaws that there is. Now the second element is also, we are already 10 years down the line after the peace agreement. So it means that there are families of the disappeared, about 1,500. Families of the people who have been killed, about 15,000 people were killed during the conflict. These families have been waited for already 10 years to have some justice. We are very much aware, and we have seen it throughout the different countries where there are traditional justice processes, that it's never possible to try every single crime or to give reparation to every single person, because also you have the way justice function with its length, but also with the request for evidences and so on and so forth. But already, if the country shows its commitment in adopting the appropriate law, in amending the act, it will be already the first step and the first way that the government will have to say to the victim, yes, we recognize you as victim.
Are you of the opinion that the mandates of these commissions should be amended so that perpetrators are booked, those of the crimes you are mentioning?
Already it should be amended along the lines that I've mentioned, yes. Because no commission and nobody, whatever his political position and his responsibility, can amnesty crimes that cannot be amnestied. So yes, this has to be changed. But at the same time, these commissions, as I say, need more resources to work. And in that case, international community would stand ready to provide these resources, provided that the mandate and the act is in coherence and consistent with international human rights law.
Well, what are your suggestions for the effective implementation of the Constitution here in Nepal?
Oh, the implementation of the Constitution is a long endeavor, which I'm sure will take several years or decades to do. I'm not sure that I'm here to give suggestions as such, but definitely what the main suggestion that apply for Nepal, like to anybody or any country in the world, is to adhere to the commitment of the Constitution. That is to say, a constitution cannot be, I would say, interpreted one day in a way or interpreted in a way another day. I would say what is important now for Nepal, this is what Nepal does, is to go through the motion of the elections. Once the federal government will be in place and the federal institutions will be in place at the three levels, local, provincial and national, I think that Nepal will have achieved at that moment already one big step towards the implementation of the constitution. Now, as you know, the constitution, for instance, has some very good provision, like the representation of women at local level, 40%, including vulnerable groups and discriminated groups, as well as at central level. If this is implemented equally, this will be a huge progress for Nepal, because even if you look now at the local election, this is the first time in the history of Nepal that among the more or less 30,000 people who have been elected now, we still have about 6,000 missing from the province too, you have 40% of women. Out of them, half of these women are actually from Dalit caste. This in itself is an important progress. So I think that if Nepal goes through the motion of this election in a very transparent, fair and democratic manner, that would be already one big step. I would say the suggestion or the recommendation, it's always to go along the line that the Constitution has defined, which this Constitution talks about the participation of people. If you want to really have a democracy, you have to make sure that the people that you represent participate in the decisions that impact their lives. That's why the inclusion component of the Constitution is so important, because for too long Nepal has had a system whereby women didn't have a voice into the decisions that impact their life, and a number of ethnic groups and castes didn't have a say in the decisions that impact their lives. So I would say what we see as a critical element, which Nepal, as I say, is taking obviously seriously, is to give voice and participation to everybody. That is what democracy is all about. You know, democracy means people's rule. These are the peoples who rule. These are their rules. That's why people elect representatives. These representatives should not represent themselves. These representatives should represent the people who have voted for them. That's the beauty of democracy.
Well, Ms. Julliand, let me come back to your work, the United Nations work here in Nepal. How do you measure the impact of United Nations work here in Nepal?
You know, as I've said, I think our work is positive because we are standing by the side of the people who are the most vulnerable. There are issues that Nepal is struggling with. Right now, the Civil and Criminal Code has been amended in order to be even more tough on the issue of chowpadi. Chowpadi, for instance, is a practice that has to be eradicated from Nepal. Of course, it doesn't take only a law to do it. You have to have the good legal framework, as well as you have to have the implementation of that law, and you have to work also side by side with the communities where it's still existing in order to raise awareness, to inform, and so on and so forth. Nepal also has a sad record when we look at child marriage. It's among the highest rate of child marriage in Asia. The same thing, the United Nations stand by the side of these young people who have their life that is cut, that is interrupted because they are married. I mean, you have still more than 10% of the marriages that are done with girls or boys below the age of 15. Nobody would want, if you ask now, do you want your boy when he's 15 or before he's 15 to be married with a matured woman? No. If you had a daughter, would you want that? No. So the United Nations makes an impact when we stand by the side of the people who have no voice. And I know that sometimes it can create some tension, because one can feel that while we give voice to the people who have no voice, it can be perceived sometimes, oh yeah, the United Nations are a little bit annoying. But that's also our mandate. The United Nations stand for the people. And actually the Charter of the United Nations says, we the people. So it means that the countries that are members of the United Nations agree that the role of the United Nations is to be that Jiminy Cricket, that one, reminding them that there are issues that need to be addressed. So I think the impact of the United Nations is actually when we are there at the side of the people, whether they are discriminated because they are girls or Dalit, whether they are discriminated because they can't have their rights and they can't enjoy their rights, that's where we have an impact as well. So I mentioned earlier on in our interview the impact that we have on policies, the impact that we have, for instance, you know that United Nations, we do a lot of capacity building, you know, helping, incapacitating the different members in the different institutions, bringing them abroad so that they can learn lessons and so on and so forth. I think that as well, but we also work by the side of the people. And I would say, and I consider that the biggest impact of the United Nations is when we speak for the people who have no voice, when we stand by the side of the people who are in a vulnerable situation.
Despite these all interventions from your side, from the United Nations, along with the government and other stakeholders here in Nepal, you know, discrimination continues. Cases, you know, those of the violations continues. What needs to be done so that the future generation would not, you know, face with the same problem that the ancestors have gone through?
Well, there are different approaches to such an issue. The first one is to have the proper framework, legal framework. And Nepal has taken the right decision with its constitution. Nepal has adopted a number of good laws. Nepal has today a legal framework that overall, of course, there is still things that need to be amended, and we mentioned transitional justice as an example. But otherwise, there are a number of good laws in Nepal. So now what Nepal needs, first and foremost, given that it has already a very good legal framework, is to make sure that the laws are implemented. And for that, what do you need? You need a strong justice system where judges are supported in their independent work of judges. You need to have an independent justice, because what does it mean? It means that if you violate the law, then there will be no impunity. You will be punished. And it's only when laws are implemented that you can force citizens to respect certain rules that exist, like for instance the rule of equality. Now at the same time, you need to work on changing the mentality, because a lot of things, like we mentioned chow paddy, are actually a heritage from traditional, you know, cultures that needs to be changed. But you don't change mentalities only with laws. You do change mentalities with law, but you also need to educate. So one big aspect to address discrimination, it's from the early age of a child, to raise children to have an education system that educates them in the logic of equality and equity. Because if children are educated along those lines, then they will become adults that are respectful. So education is also one path. And then for adults, whom you can't bring back to school, you have to do a number of education awareness, but this time through community. So there is a lot of work that also needs to be done at community level. Because you see, some of this practice that are actually harmful for people, very often are not done because people are bad. It's because people don't know. It's because people have never been made aware. People have never been made to think about what they do. So that's why there is that whole work to be done also at community level. So you need to have a legal framework. You need to have a strong justice system. You need to have a good education system. And you need to have this work of following up and working with communities. And you also need to have leaders at all levels, leaders in the government, leaders in the private sector, leaders in the academias who give example of the best behavior.
Well, Ms. Julliand, there are really interesting issues coming up, but we are coming to the end of the show. Could you tell us how United Nations is going to work in future in relation to Nepal's development work very quickly?
Absolutely. We just recently, on the 1st of September, signed with the government our new strategy, which is called the United Nations Development Assistance Framework. It's called UNDAF. This document actually highlights 4 priorities for Nepal in the eyes of the United Nations, and where the United Nations is going to put all its effort. First, inclusive economic growth, to make sure that prosperity is created but is also shared among everybody. So inclusive for everybody, with a focus on the poor people, on the excluded people. The second one is social development. And here we put a particular emphasis on health and education, because when you look at the indicators of Nepal, they have progressed, but there is still very high rate, for instance, of malnutrition. And when you look at the disaggregation of this rates of malnutrition, you see that geographically there is a big impact. People are more malnourished in the Terai or in the western region than they are in Kathmandu. So education, health, as well as the overall social protection, second component. Third component, resilience, climate change, and disaster risk management. I mean, after the earthquake, everybody realized how vulnerable Nepal can be, and then Nepal needs the reconstruction. But Nepal needs a very good disaster risk management framework to make sure that tomorrow's earthquake will not be the same disaster as the one that happened in 2015, but also building the resilience of people and addressing, as Nepal is a member of the international community, to address issue of climate change. And the third one, which is very important, it's governance. The forefront, is governance, rule of law, and human rights. So helping with the implementation of the constitution, helping with the federalization of the country, working on the justice system that I mentioned, and of course, on the human rights aspect.
Well, Ms. Julliand, thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Dear audience, time now to wrap up the show. Keep watching us. See you next week. Namaste.